It's interesting as to because you probably aren't churning. Oh, there we go. But
I mean, we can talk about credit card points. It's relevant to financial planning. I'm not, I don't churn. I do like one a year basically and just do whatever. And so I thought I would do this and they didn't offer me a good enough bonus to make it
they don't
worthwhile.
value your business.
Apparently. I mean, that's actually probably fair. I don't spend a lot of money, uh,
Yeah.
but I
Well,
tried. So I might, I mean, I'll probably just, get another Chase one at some point since it's, the fees are low, but, in the meantime,
uh,
go to New York. Gonna see some shows as we vamp and kill. What time is it? Killed 45
we
seconds.
have
We'll give everybody
yeah.
another minute and a
We're
half or
gonna get
so.
started in 1 minute. In the meantime, let us know if you're traveling anywhere for the holidays. Jeff's coming up to New York. We're just talking about um, as someone who's lived in New York for a year, I still haven't attended a play. Uh, so that's kind of a
I see
goal
more plays in a weekend when visiting New York than you've probably literally ever. We were
in
there
my life.
in, when was it? We were there for Leah's birthday, and we saw two shows set Friday and Saturday nights. Uh,
Wow.
and we'll do the
I am
same.
very excited to be seeing Seinfeld this weekend.
Yeah,
So
it's good.
this is but let us know where you're joining us from if you have any fun holiday plans.
Always curious to see how many old faces we see and how many new. It's the holidays, so people I'm sure are kind of bouncing around, but it's usually a good familiar group. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll hop in for a interesting one this time. We'll be talking about the news again. It's always fun. But yeah, coming up Friday afternoon. We've got the kind of classic Christmas weekend. The kids' winter concert is Friday morning, and then coming up to New York, gonna bounce around. Kids are hoping it snows. I'm sure you're not, Monty.
Yeah.
So anyway, 2:02 Eastern. I feel like that's probably a good time as any to jump
Yes.
in. Welcome everyone again to another in our series number 45 in our webinar series. We're talking about Nvidia today, and specifically how Jensen, Nvidia's founder, saved a very large dollar amount in mostly estate taxes through clever planning. Both of us, but I'm Jeff. I run a bunch of stuff, including product and strategy here. And I've got Monty with me again, the two of us. Monty founded the company and is going to tell you a little bit about us before we dig in.
Yeah. And first of all, thanks for everyone joining us. I know it gets busy at this time of the year. And just as a quick introduction on Valor, if you don't know about us. So our goal is to really help people to make it accessible to do what people like Jensen do. So our idea is how do we help people take what are the best in class practices to avoid ordinary income, capital gains, and estate taxes, and we help you understand what those options are. Whether webinars like this, we have a lot of content, calculators, so you can understand what the strategies are, what are their quantitative as well as qualitative trade-offs. We also help you set up these structures, and the education and setup are all done for free. And then we typically charge flat annual costs to take care of all the administration, and that includes unlimited support and kind of optimization. And really, our goal is how do we help bring best-in-class tax mitigation to beyond billionaires? So we don't want just Jensen doing this. You may not save $8 billion, but we want you to be able to save just as meaningful amount for you and your family. So
That's right. And I think there's a key point there, and we're going to be talking a lot about some strategies that, and a New York Times article that unearthed them, and that describes this as kind of rarefied air, right? That's something that the billionaires do. They mention the founders of other major companies as having taken advantage of these strategies, but there's nothing magical about this stuff. There's nothing that makes it kind of only available to those folks, except that until Valor came along, it was expensive, it was time consuming, it was challenging. And our goal is to take stuff that's really available and applies just as well to you and me, and make it something that everyone can do. And we'll talk a lot about how one might do that throughout the day here. The agenda here is straightforward. We are going to talk a little bit about the gift and estate tax, and specifically how it works, who it applies to, what the numbers are, so you understand kind of how we're motivating and building up to the numbers that you see in that article and that we're going to talk about today. We'll talk at a high level about Jensen's strategy, the individual vehicles that he's pursued, and then we'll dig into each of them and talk about at a tactical level how they work, what the numbers look like, and how you can kind of do the same thing. We'll always leave time, as you know, for Q&A, but really importantly, these things are a lot more fun if you chime in with questions as we go. So please don't hesitate. We'll bring your question up to the onto the screen, and we'll talk about it. So please do feel free to jump in. So getting right into it, this is in some ways kind of just necessary background. We assume that most of you have some context on this stuff. You're here to learn about Jensen's strategy for estate tax, but it's important context that everyone should have. So how does the gift and estate tax work? The concept here, which many of you have, is that in the US, and specifically at the federal level, but also in many states, you're allowed to give away a certain amount of money without any transfer tax, without paying taxes on the amount that you give to other people. And then every dollar that you give away above that level, and we'll talk about what that is, will be taxed. Again, definitely at the federal level and in many states. So what does that look like? How much is it? Well, importantly, we're talking about a 40% federal rate and up to 12% at the state level, yielding tax that goes above 50% on those marginal dollars. And specifically with the July tax bill increasing the exemption, you can now give away, or starting on January 1st of next year, you'll be able to give away $15 million. And your spouse, if you're married, will be able to give away $15 million. And together, you'll be able to give away $30 million without paying any federal gift and estate tax. And that's during your life, when you pass away, all together. But if you give away $1 more than that, you'll start paying that 40% federal tax, assuming that you don't do the kind of advanced planning that we're going to be talking about here. In addition to that, lifetime giving limit, as I think a lot of you know, because this is the kind of giving that people do much more frequently, you can give away a certain amount every year without even using up that exemption. So you can give away $19,000 to every recipient you want to every year without ever dipping into that $15 million overall exemption. I can give $19,000 to each of my kids. My spouse can do the same. Together, we can give $76,000 away without triggering any sort of exemption or gift tax. That's a very common strategy. That's kind of on the small end. That's the first thing that a lot of people do in planning here. What we're focused on today is the bigger swings, the major trusts, the kind of things that can move millions, tens of millions, or even more out of your estate. Somebody, you want to kind of talk about, introduce the Jensen story?
Yeah. So, and to this point, like now, an interesting thing to what Jeff called out is the state taxes. It's very high, like 53%, right? Can exceed what ordinary income taxes are in the highest states. The estate tax is also the easiest tax to avoid with planning and existing structures. And Jensen is a great case study of this. Of he did early planning and also helped in appreciating assets. But by the way, the interesting news is you don't even need appreciating assets to avoid estate taxes. But let's talk about Jensen. He started doing this in 2007, so a little less than 20 years ago. And since then, he saved over $8 billion in estate taxes that we can see. And the answer is it's probably higher and could be significantly higher if he had candidly really wanted to or been more aggressive. And so we'll dive into kind of what that looks like and how he did it and what were the different vehicles he used.
And really important, Monty, just to take a beat here, this story is about Jensen and it's about Nvidia. And that makes sense because Nvidia has been the fastest growing company in the world for several years now with no signs of stopping. At the same time, there's nothing unique about this story, right? There's nothing special about Nvidia shares or the way the company was structured or really anything. This story applies to anyone who owns shares in a growing company, right?
Yeah, 100%. In a growing company, and this is where, if you take this from 8 billion to 800 million, there's probably hundreds or thousands of people that we could write the same story about. Really, this is focused on Jensen and Nvidia because of, to your point, this is the hottest company. The dollars are a little bit larger, and there's been more focus, so we have more details on it. So it's easy to walk through his exact playbook. And candidly, it's not a unique playbook. We'll go through his story, but we'll also talk about how this can apply to really anyone else, to Jeff's point.
That's right.
And this is this is kind of true of most of these scenarios, but this is a grand slam. $8 billion. This is, by the way, good. And by the way, the number could have been a lot higher. And that's because he just followed the playbook of which structures to use and got started early.
That's right. You know, I feel like we have one of these provocative quotes in all of these presentations. Last week it was, or 2 weeks ago, it was that only morons pay the estate tax. Here, this is a grand slam. You know, a lot about this story is provocative, but the bread and butter, what's under the hood is just, hey, look, there's a number of tried and true strategies that you can take advantage of if you're, you know, on top of this, which Jensen was, and you could be too.
Yeah,
So we are
and
going to be talking. Yeah, go ahead.
another, I just want, yeah, I want to say one thing is like, it's calling a grand slam, but it's candidly giving kind of the estate space a lot of credit. A lot of this is just if you decide to get started early, these opportunities, and Jeff's going to go into what these structures are, it's there. So the thing is, do you want to take advantage of this? Do you want to avoid those taxes? And if so, can you get started early? That's really all it takes to create a grand slam.
That's right. And when it doesn't cost anything to start early because Valor exists, that's a great way to just kind of get moving on this stuff. So what are we going to be talking about today? This article that we've been referring to mentions 4 groups of strategies, and these really map very well to the categories of strategy that we like to talk about. The first is GRATs. This is grantor retained annuity trusts. That's the splashy, well-known strategy you hear a lot about. And this is the one that had the biggest impact on Jensen's estate because Nvidia grew so fast. And we'll explain why that is and how that worked. We'll talk about IDGTs, IDGTs. That's intentionally defective grantor trusts. Also super valuable, a very common move for people in this sort of situation, and a way to move substantial value, as you can see, out of your estate. Those two focus on the estate side and are kind of cousins of each other, and we'll talk about them together. Then we have charitable structures. This is in some ways a very different move. It's about actually giving money away, but doing so in a way that is efficient with respect to both estate taxes and potentially capital gain and even ordinary income taxes. And so we'll talk in some depth there. One thing we won't mention in too much depth is the family limited partnership. This is kind of an umbrella structure that a lot of families use. Doesn't on its own necessarily move the needle quite as much as the individual strategies, but we wanted to put it up here to let you know that it is there, and it's a concept that, you know, we're happy to talk about if it's interesting. I'll take the first one here and talk about how GRATs work. And you know, I prompted Monty to preview this a little earlier. GRATs are something that applies logically to any appreciated asset. I'll talk about this, but it's really important as I talk through this structure to understand that the logic here is going to apply whether you own Google shares, Meta shares, SpaceX, Databricks, OpenAI, public, private companies, any appreciated asset, and especially one that's growing fast. This is going to work for, and I'll talk about how. So what is a GRAT? It's a grantor retained annuity trust. And the concept here, before I get into the step-by-step, is that you can move assets out of your estate and then let them grow. And the growth will go to your beneficiaries, totally free of estate tax. This is a very clean move. And it also has the benefit of you retaining the original principles. How does that work? The first thing you do, and what Jensen did, is you gift cash or often shares, like shares of Nvidia, to a trust for a beneficiary, typically your kids. Let's say you move $1 million, let's say $10 million, trying to pick bigger numbers because, you know, Jensen used big numbers. You move $10 million of shares to a GRAT. Those assets, we assume that you're putting them in a fast-growing company like Nvidia or leaving them there. Those assets grow over the term of the trust, which for reasons we won't get too deep into right now is typically 2 years. But these strategies last for many decades. It's a little bit technical. The assets grow over the trust's term. You, having given those shares to the trust, you will get back your original $10 million plus interest at the IRS's statutory rate. And we'll talk about the rate Jensen got and the rate today. So you'll get back that $10 million plus interest over those couple of years. And anything that's left in the trust will go to your kids free of estate tax. Essentially, the structure lets your assets grow outside of your estate. And so you can see how that works. If you invest that money in fast-growing shares, and you get a rate of return that is substantially more than the IRS interest rate, you're going to end up with a lot of money left in your trust, which will go to your kids tax-free. And that's exactly what Jensen
Yeah, and
did.
I want to call out there's kind of this dichotomy of Jeff talked about this up front is the gift exemption is changing to $15 million per spouse on January 1st. And so if you're thinking through this, okay, if you're married or single, you can give away 15 or 30 million. And then you're probably wondering, how does Jensen avoid $8 billion in estate taxes when he can give away, and by the way, when he did this, the state exemption was far below 15 million. So you're probably wondering, how is he able to do that? The short answer on this is, and with each of these structures that we're going to talk to today, you can call it a loophole or an opportunity. There is a way to gift far beyond that estate exemption without paying estate taxes. The loophole for GRATs are you can gift assets without using any of your gift exemption. So you can put this to what Jeff was saying is all the growth above the IRS's interest rate passes on tax-free to your heirs without using your gift exemption. And so let's play this out for Jensen's scenario. He gifted $100 million in Nvidia shares. The IRS interest rate was 1.8%. And so what that means is Jensen's essentially the GRAT that Jensen put these shares into has to pay him back $100 million plus 1.8 interest percent for each of the years that's the applicable rate. It's obviously pretty low. And I think everyone here, we have to explain this. You can look at this chart. Nvidia has grown a lot faster than 1.8%. So effectively all of that upside above 1.8% passed on to Jensen's heirs with using $0 from his gift exemption and is outside of his estate. So it not only uses zero exemption, all the future growth once it passes on outside of his estate is also estate tax-free. And this is why just on this, we've seen that he saved $6 billion in estate taxes. And honestly, the number might be significantly higher.
Yeah, I want to just do the math really quickly for people. And look, your assets, most of the assets that we all own are not going to grow. Nvidia has grown 225x since March 2016. So that 100 million theoretically, should be much more than that. We don't know exactly what it is. That might not be what happens, but if your assets grow 3x in that trust term or over 10 years, all of that growth is going to your kids. And importantly, as Mani said, because you're taking back the starting value, that's, you use the word loophole. I'd use the word, kind of close reading of the statute, right? These trusts are set up so that if you zero them out, which means you take back the amount plus interest, well, everything else is outside of your estate. And that's exactly, how this works.
Not to get too deep down a tangent, which I'm terrible at. The crazy thing about GRATs here is, so the way that Jensen used GRATs, it truly is a weird loophole because the reason they exist the way they are is Congress passed a law to try to outlaw the most popular previous estate planning structure called a GRIT. Now, ignore the name. Estate planning lawyers are pretty terrible with naming. But when they passed that law, they didn't realize the impact of it. The family behind Walmart saw the opportunity or their team saw the opportunity for GRATs. They took advantage of it. The IRS sued them. The Walton family initially lost, took it to the Supreme Court. And to what Jeff was saying, they essentially found that if you actually followed the interpretation of the law, that's what allowed GRATs to exist the way they do today. And that's kind of why, Jensen, not even being very aggressive, could avoid $6 billion.
That's right. I want to call up an important question here from Arthur. Is the IRS rate still 1.8%? Did it go up? What does that mean for this strategy? This is a really important, really good question. The answer, I think, unsurprisingly to everybody, will be no. The IRS rate is not still 1.8%. It did go down from 2016 all the way down to about 0.5% in 2020, which would have been a great time to do a GRAT. Today, this month, it's 4.6%. And so the candid answer here is mathematically, that is slightly worse for someone setting up a GRAT because you now have to beat a 4.6% hurdle rate to get anything to your kids. But really importantly, if you model this, you'll find that that is not a hard number to beat, right? Most of us are investing for a much more significant growth rate than 4.6%. And that growth in the interest rate doesn't actually drag down the overall returns, and certainly does very much, and certainly doesn't kind of upend the logic here. If you beat 4.6%, then money's going to go to your kids tax-free, estate tax-free. And that's still true whether the rate is 0 or 2 or 6 or even 8, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is an important piece to call out is yes, returns are lower. By the way, historical S&P growth rates are, about 10%. So this is where of like most even bonds are typically, corporate bonds are above 4.6. So it's not, yes, it's higher, but it is still typically below what you're able to return if you're investing this in anything beyond
Yeah, and that's actually a really important
treasuries.
point. We are focused on someone who put the fastest growing stock in history into a grat at the perfect time. We
Yeah.
have plenty of clients, and there are, as Monty said, thousands of families, probably millions of families, who have set up grats and just thrown the S&P in there and gotten their 10%. Maybe one year it's 20, maybe one year it's 0, and that is a killer strategy too. You don't need to own Nvidia for this to make sense. It makes it a lot more valuable, and you should absolutely try to find the next Nvidia. But this works if you're getting 10%, 8% growth a year,
Yeah.
even at the current
If you
interest
do have the next NVIDIA, please also share in the
rate. Let us
comments.
know.
I'm mostly joking. Um,
So we don't need to belabor this point. We're running long as usual. This is just an important point very quickly, as we said, and this is kind of consistent with what we've been talking about. This strategy is agnostic as to the asset. If you've got an asset that is going to grow fast in the future, then the kinds of things we're talking about here today, GRATs, IDGTs, charitable planning, absolutely make mathematical sense. And there are, at this point, tens of thousands, maybe bordering on more than that, individual shareholders, early shareholders at these companies, or honestly, not even that early, right? We're talking about folks getting 0.1% of
yeah,
OpenAI today and having $10 million of stock. Those are precisely the kinds of assets and
yeah,
shareholders and employees who can take
yeah.
advantage of these strategies.
Yeah, and this is to the reason we have these three companies. These are some of the examples of people we work with, and they're doing these exact strategies for all of these shares here.
Yeah, I think the
And
important
just
point here is that someone owning early equity, or especially early equity in a company that grows like this, has major upside that you can capture and grow with additional tax planning. Pre-liquidity planning is especially valuable. It's an important point with all three companies listed here. And that getting started on this stuff reasonably early, like Jensen did, is key. And that's why we chose these companies. It is still early days for all three of these. But that's true of, again, hundreds of companies out there whose value is growing substantially. Monty, you want to talk about kind of how we quantify this stuff?
yeah, and this is to kind of what Jeff was saying earlier. I'm just gonna pull this up. This is an example of one of the tools we have. This is freely accessible. We'll share this in the chat. Um, the This is just an example. So we're going to take this is the graph structure that we're talking about. By the way, we have this for all the different structures. And the point is to help illustrate what is the value of this structure. So let's say you put $10 million into a GRAT. You can adjust this number. Let's say this is growing at 10% per year and you're 50 years old. What this is saying is that if you just use a GRAT, and by the way, you're going to use other structures as well, you could, assuming that 10% growth and a normal expected kind of you're going to live as long as a typical 50-year-old, you would be able to pass on somewhere between 274 to $300 million after estate taxes to your heirs. Versus if you didn't use a GRAT, you'd pass on 158 million. So it's roughly doubling how much you can pass on, and this is with a 10% growth, right? So if we increase this, if you have the next Nvidia, these numbers go up dramatically because of compounding. And so, even if you're more conservative, let's say it's an 8% growth, it's still slightly less than doubling what you pass on. And really, the whole point of this is how you get to kind of the Jensen of avoiding $8 billion. This works for really any amount where you're facing the estate taxes. And we're going to share this in the chat. But the broad point is, if you're worried about estate taxes, you want to get started earlier versus later. And this will help you figure out what's the magnitude and what's part of the plan to get there.
That's right. I want to take a moment to just drive home. Yes, early planning is important. We'll talk about what happens if you haven't planned early, and the answer is it's not too late, really, ever. But really importantly, it costs nothing to figure out if now's the time. We have the tools, and it's worth just having a conversation with us or with any planner, but especially us, to figure out, what are those early steps you can take? What are the reasonably low cost, non-invasive, low overhead things you can do to capture the kind of value that Monty was flagging there. So really, that's really it on GRATs, and we're going to talk about IDGTs. The story is largely similar. If anyone has any further questions on how GRATs work, we do have some time. Happy to answer those as we go. But Mani, you want to introduce the concept of IDGTs?
Yeah. So IDGTs are, let's start with this. IDGTs are probably the most popular vehicle for estate planning. And so, and the reason behind this is particularly for families that are worried about estate taxes. It is potentially the most efficient way to avoid taxes. And the reason behind this is the basic, you can gift assets, whether it's cash, stock, or other assets to a trust for beneficiaries. Typically it'll be all your future heirs. The most important thing about this is whoever sets up the trust can pay the income taxes on the income inside the trust. So if you gift 10, $20 million to this trust, and again, let's say it's growing at 8 or 10% per year, in most cases, the trust would pay those taxes. But instead, you can personally pay those taxes, and it doesn't count as an additional gift. So let's say you gift $10 million to the trust. You're just using $10 million of your exemption, but then you can pay the income taxes every year. And the important part about this is one is it means the trust grows tax-free or income tax-free. All the growth is estate tax-free as well. And so it is going to leave more value behind your heirs because, first of all, everyone here would rather their assets grow tax-free versus not because they'll grow faster. And IDGTs essentially allow you to do this. And the third and biggest benefit that's kind of tied to this is while you, the grantor, are paying the taxes, that does what is called a reducing the size of your estate. Because let's say you've run out of gift exemption, you've used your entire 30 million if you're married or 15 million if you're not married, you can still pay the taxes on the trust. And so as the trust gets larger and larger because it's growing, you will quote unquote burn down or reduce the size of your estate by paying those taxes. And this is how you indirectly are able to avoid further estate taxes.
That's right. I want to. That's right. You're right to focus on the burning because that's one of the main uses of IDGTs. I want to highlight or remind that there's also the kind of straightforward freezing and growth story here, which behaves in many ways a lot like a GRAT. Right? You're putting assets into the trust. After you give them to the trust, assuming you have some exemption left, or if you use leverage to do so, the growth is free of estate tax, the same way it is in a GRAT, and that alongside this burning concept is super powerful, and
Yeah.
that's part of why this is so
Yeah.
so common. Mani, you want to take the first step at charitable giving?
Yeah, and this is yes. So this is now charitable giving. This is it's an interesting question of.
So sorry, I put that up. Then you started. Why don't we take Michael's question? It goes back to GRATs before we move on to charitable giving. So the question is, what does the GRAT strategy do for the cost basis when it leaves the trust? Are they selling at a huge gain? This is a really important question. It goes to things like the step up. It goes to the tax in the trust and afterward. Mani, you want to answer?
Yeah. So the answer is it does not change the cost basis. So then, Michael, kind of the implication of your question is okay. So okay, I don't use my gift exemption. I'm able to pass on to my kids this appreciated asset, right? It's appreciated because that's how it's passed through the GRAT. But then if they sell it or they need money, they have to pay the taxes. Well, it's a good thing we just talked about IDGTs. You can make the beneficiary of the GRAT a type of IDGT that's for your children. And so the impact of this is, let's say we'll just keep on using Nvidia share, or let's say use SpaceX shares. You put SpaceX shares in the trust because SpaceX, keeps on appreciating. It may go public next year. It passes on to what's called a crummy trust for your kids. The crummy trust is a type of IDGT where you can pay the taxes. So then if the crummy trust sells those assets, the crummy trust doesn't pay the taxes, your kids don't pay the taxes, you can. And it's obviously an option, but the short answer is the cost basis doesn't change, but they would be selling at a huge gain. But how you set this up is going to impact who pays the taxes. And then the one last piece is, let's say you don't want your kids to pay the taxes, you could pass it on to them. This isn't a webinar on charitable renter trust. We have plenty of those. You could use a charitable renter trust for your kids to sell those SpaceX shares on a tax-deferred basis, so there aren't taxes up front.
And that's all right. And I'll just add a very small tactical point, but that comes up maybe earlier in the process for a lot of people, which is not what happens when I eventually want to sell, but literally, I said these trusts last for 2 years. At the end of those 2 years, you're going to have to give your kids this money. And there's a major question, which is, are they hit with that tax right away? And the answer is no. They don't have to be. You can transfer these shares out of the trust, both to give yourself back the principal and also to give your kids the growth in kind. You can move the shares to them. It's not a taxable event at that moment. So you're certainly not accelerating a tax bill. You're certainly not raising that tax bill. It looks no different than if you didn't have the trust on the income tax side. And then, as Mani said, you can take advantage of all these additional steps to further reduce that tax down the road. So I guess, the IDGTs we sped through mostly because the concept is a lot like a GRAT. The logic is sound, and there's not much more to say. We're happy to kind of double click on that stuff if folks want, but with the time left, I think maybe we spend some time on charitable giving, which is a whole separate thing.
The one last piece I want to call out on IDGTs is, it sounds like a minor thing to say, hey, you're paying the income taxes on the trust. One of these important things is, even if you understand compounding, we all always underestimate compounding. I do this, and I talk about it every single day. This is one of those things of, your assets are probably going to double every 7 to 10 years. And so what that means is your tax, first of all, the tax liability is every year. That tax liability is going to double every 7 to 10 years. In 14 to 20 years, it's going to 4x. And what that means is every single year, your tax liability gets larger. And that's a really powerful concept as to how do you over time reduce your taxes. And this is why it's like, if you're trying to avoid estate taxes, let's say you had $1 billion or $10 billion, you can get there in 20, 25 years just by between using IDGTs and GRATs. And I know it sounds complicated. This is a preview. We're launching a calculator that'll be able to show you how that works and the timeline and the confidence level you can have to do that and how these things pair together.
That's right. And just to put a fine point on it, you take $1 and you burn it down by paying $1 of tax for your IDGT. Well, that dollar, as Mani said, in 20 years would have been worth $4. In 30 years, it would have been worth $8. That $8 in 30 years would have been in your estate, subject to 40 or 50% tax. You're talking about saving $3 or $4 of estate tax for every dollar that you pay taxes for the trust. That's why we say you really can't overestimate how valuable this burning concept is. We're talking about having an extra, even for modest estates, an extra $10 million at the end, just by taking this little step of paying the trust taxes. So charitable giving, I think we can do a few beats on this. We're going to talk here broadly about why one would give to charity as a tax strategy or a combination tax and giving strategy. And we'll also look at a couple of these specific strategies that Jensen used. Mani, you want to take it?
Yeah. And so there's a couple reasons to give charitably, right? Like, there's one, you want to do good in the world and you want to be altruistic. That's one reason. There's also a ton of tax reasons to do so. So there's charitable structures. So Jensen used a donor advised fund. It's also called as a DAF, the GE Forest Donor Advised Fund. This is typically very charitably inclined. It gives you a big tax deduction, but you should only really use a DAF if you are trying to, it only makes sense if you're trying to be altruistic and give. A DAF isn't a tax planning vehicle. It is a charitable vehicle that does good in the world and has some tax benefits, but you're not going to come out personally ahead by using a DAF.
The way I put it, Mani, is that it is discounted charitable giving, potentially substantially discounted, right? You might get back 80 cents on the dollar. If you do this right, you're still only getting back 80 cents. You have to want to give away something, right?
Yes, 100%. And then there's private foundations. Private foundations are somewhat similar to DAFs. It is mostly charitably inclined, but the big kind of benefits that you get are mostly qualitative. Of what it means is you can control how these funds are used. You can set up programs to run it. And there's a lot of, I'm sure everyone here has seen a hospital wing that's named after someone famous. In San Francisco, there's named after the Zuckerberg family. If you go into New York, you see it all named after all sorts of different families. This is a lot of things are from these private foundations. So there's, in many cases, people are using, you could argue there's branding, there's societal value, it opens up doors. People do use it for that. They also use it to, there's particular causes or things they don't see on the world, and they want to use these dollars to further fund and create that. And this is where, we work with someone who's created a gorilla refuge in Africa. And that you see these kind of things of, that's something they're very wildlife oriented. And so they're able to do that. Now, we call that the pure tax benefits can be, you can get income tax deductions. And there are ways, the income tax deduction from this, again, it's discounted giving. You don't do it for the income tax deduction. You would do it, that would make sense if you also care about charitable giving. The real big tax benefit is there's a structure called a charitable lead annuity trust. We're not sure if Jensen used it or not, but this is a really effective way, particularly if you're charitably inclined, you're over the estate exemption. It allows you to, similar to a GRAT, to gift assets outside of your estate without using any of your gift exemption. And we see people use this for really large estates when they're candidly a little bit older and want to get assets outside of their estates. It's a really effective way to lock that in. Those are kind of like the big pieces. And we kind of talked about this. This is something where you can create a family legacy, values. Another thing we typically see, we sometimes see, is families will do this because they want to create an opportunity for kids to pursue their passions. So in ways that are more altruistic, and so they'll see their kids be more involved in their foundations as well.
That's right. You mentioned CLATs, Monty. We're not going to belabor this, but there's also charitable remainder trusts, which are a whole other category here.
Yeah.
That is something that Jensen could have pursued, and that certainly you all can on the pure income capital gain tax side. Taking a step back and thinking about kind of how Jensen dropped the ball here, which is funny to say because he saved $8 billion. But his estate at this point, just multiplying number of shares that he's disclosed by the Nvidia share price, is massive. And there's more he could have done, right? And some of this is, really all of this are things we've already talked about. The first is, well, he could have given larger GRAT gifts. He could have, really, had he known Nvidia was going to do what it did, he could have moved more of his shares to his kids earlier on while still retaining an ungodly amount of money.
Potentially. Can I jump in and add one thing? One thing I want to call out is, unless you have like immediate health issues, and even then, you should, if you don't want to pay estate taxes, you should pay zero estate taxes with planning, right? Like, this is, unless you don't do any planning and get hit by a bus, you should pay zero in estate taxes. And this is why, Jeff's point is like, hey, $8 billion sounds like a lot. Justin could do a lot more. And by the way, this may be the right answer for him because this is what he wants, but he could also do significantly more if he wanted to.
That's right, and that's where we're going here. We mentioned larger GRAT gifts. He could have done a CLAT. He could have done a CRUT. He could have, maybe grown his IDGT more. It probably wouldn't make sense for him to do crummy trusts, which move, $20,000 a year out of his estate, but he could have. Now we're here, right? Jensen's estate is still massive as far as we know, even after all of this planning. So what does he do? And the question, I think, is really important because it applies just as well to kind of normal people who have a lot of money and who maybe didn't do everything they could have done to optimize early, whether they just didn't put enough into their trusts or they didn't even get to trust planning until later in life. The door is not closed. Absolutely, it's better to move early because you have kind of more visibility on things. You can kind of be more strategic. At the same time, as Mani said, you always have the opportunity to burn your estate via things like paying the IDGTs taxes and other moves. And that's why, Mani said, depending on your age, we can tell you the probability that you can get your estate to zero over a certain number of years. And the bottom line is, if you're, really anything other than very, very old, and if you're willing to take these steps and be aggressive about it, you can get your estate basically to zero in only a reasonably short time. And even Jensen could reduce his substantially with those.
Jensen can get his down to zero. This is the thing. Jensen's 62. He can very easily, and this is why we don't know what his intentions and what his goals are. He can easily get this down to his estate tax down to zero. And this is one of those crazy things of, I think he's worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and the whole point is you can get it down to zero. And so this is where, if he can, anyone who's facing the estate tax really should.
That's right.
If that's what you want.
Kind of related question again from Arthur. We appreciate it. Can you combine GRATs and charitable giving? And I'll just make this even broader. Can you combine all of these strategies? Is there anything stopping you from doing all of this? And the answer is no. But maybe you can dig in, Mani.
Yeah. There's nothing preventing it, and this is typically we've kind of hinted at this. There is a 1 + 1 = 3 in kind of these estate planning strategies. There's a lot of synergies to how you use these things together. And so the idea is, typically the answer is no. And this is particularly, your biggest constraint is how much you can give directly with your estate exemption. But then you'll combine these things of, you may use a GRAT when you run into your estate exemption, you'll use a GRAT plus the CLAT, plus maybe you'll give to a foundation to set up to do, whatever you prioritize. And so you'll typically use these things in combination. And kind of candidly, the more you use, the faster or easier it is to get your estate tax liability down to zero if that's your goal.
That's right. And my view is once you've got the basics down, and that's not just the basics of a will and a revocable trust and health directives and adoption, plans for your kids, but rather the basics of a crummy trust and a basic IDGT and maybe moving some of your fast growing stock into a GRAT. At that point, it does become about deciding what you want to do. What are your goals? Is your goal to pay zero estate tax? Is your goal to leave a large amount of money to a charity you care about? Is it to do a mix of the two to plan for your kids and a charity? Do you want to involve the grandkids, friends and family? Once you're at this point and you've gotten those basic 3 or 4 structures down, then it's really just about what are you optimizing for? And the answer is you can combine all of these and we can help you do it. But the first question is like, what's your number 1, 2, and 3 goal? And we can meet them all. 2:40 and a few seconds, so good for us, hitting the mark almost perfectly. We've reached the end. Any more questions, I'll vamp for a couple of minutes and we'll give you some time. But want to thank everybody for taking the time. Thank Arthur and Michael for the good questions. This is the end of the year for us on the webinar side. It's not the end of the year, decidedly so. On the business side, we are still processing, I see some other names here, many of your trusts and renewable energy projects and more. There is still time to get things done. But even if not, we'll see you in the new year. We'll be coming back and talking much more about these subjects. In the meantime, get in touch. Of course, come check out valor.com and the Learn site, learn.valor.com. You can read about all of this. Email me or Mani directly. Schedule a call we have their valor.com/schedule. I'll also put it up here as a banner. We're available. We're eager to talk to you all and your clients if you're an advisor and chat about this stuff. Our view is that there's a strategy for everybody and it's worth a chat. So don't hesitate to get in touch. Mani, anything to add before we call it?
No, I think that's a big thing. And this is, I hope everyone has a happy holidays. But yes, please let us know if you have last minute tax things to take care of.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.